Islam in 1 century conquered 3/4 of Christendom permanently. Most of the attacks and the assaults were from the Muslims on Christian lands. And even the Crusades were actually part of just war. Recall that all those territories I told you about, including the Holy Land, Jerusalem, and Egypt, were Christian before Muslims took it. The first Crusaders were aware of this. So when they were going there, in their mind, they were liberating ancient Christian territories and bringing them back under Christian rule, which again fits into just war theory. But so what actually provoked the First Crusade again was a new wave of Islamic jihad and terror was taking place, especially after the year 1071, after the pivotal battle of Manzikert in Asia Minor, close to Armenia. After the Turks won that, basically Anatolia, or Asia Minor, or what we now call Turkey, one of the most ancient Christian regions, it's where St. Paul wrote many of his epistles to, was overrun by Turks, and they just engaged in all sorts of atrocities and slaughters. And according to the contemporary sources, tens if not hundreds of thousands of Christians, mostly Greeks and Armenians, were butchered and slaughtered, and the rest taken into slavery. And the churches were desecrated ritually and burned and torched and turned into mosques. Just in one city alone, Ani, 1,000 churches were torched to the ground. What I'm describing to you is right before the First Crusades, but all of these types of atrocities were what were occurring from the very start during the initial conquests that began in the 7th century. I mean, have you ever heard, for example, of the Mad Caliph, Hakim Ba'amrullah? In the year 1009, or 1009, he actually, according to Muslim sources, I'm thinking of the Arab historian al-Makrizi, destroyed 30,000 churches in 1 year in Greater Syria and Egypt. So again, that underscores how Christian that region was already into the 11th century and the sorts of persecution that Muslims were putting them through. So anyway, fast forward again to what I was telling you, 1071, Asia Minor is now being overrun and killed. And now here's a quote from Emperor Alexius I. He was the Eastern Roman, or as they call it, Byzantine emperor. And he summarized what was happening to Asia Minor and to Christians in a letter to his friend, Count Robert of Flanders, who would actually become one of the first leaders of the First Crusade. So here's a quote. "The holy places are desecrated and destroyed in countless ways. Noble mothers and their daughters, robbed of everything, are violated one after another like animals. Some of their rapists shamelessly place virgins in front of their own mothers and force them to sing wicked and obscene songs until they have finished having their ways with them. Men of every age and description, boys, youths, old men, nobles, peasants, and what is worse still and yet more distressing, clerks and monks, and woe of woes, even bishops are forcibly defiled with the sin of sodomy." So they were raping the holy men and the monks and so forth. So, after the passage of these 5 centuries of peaceful coexistence, we finally come to the Council of Clermont in 1095, where Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade. He too knew what was going on, and here's a quote of what he said. "They, the Muslims, have completely destroyed some of God's churches and have converted others to the use of their own cult," meaning mosques. "They ruin the altars with filth and defilement. They circumcise Christians and smear the blood from the circumcision of the altars and throw it into the baptismal fonts. They are pleased to kill others by cutting open their bellies, extracting the end of their intestines, and tying it to a stake. Then with flogging, they drive their victims around the stake until, when their viscera have spilled out, they fall dead on the ground. They tie others again to stakes and shoot arrows at them. They seize others, stretch out their necks, and try to see whether they can cut off their heads with a single blow of a naked sword. And what shall I say about the shocking rape of women? Who is to repair this damage if you do not do it? Rise up and remember the manly deeds of your ancestors." And it is at that point that the famous phrase Deus vult came, where they all got up and said, "God wills it." So such are the heroic and noble origins of the First Crusade, which everyone has been taught is one of the blackest parts of Western Christian history of all time. We can get into some more of the lies. I'm not sure how we're doing on time. Are we good on time? Yeah. So some more of the fake histories you may have heard. You may have heard about like Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain, and just how wonderful it was, and how back when the Christians were poor and miserable and evil, and Al-Andalus was great. And this is, of course, when the Muslims entered and conquered Spain, and supposedly the Golden Age is something like in the 800s. Well, they don't tell you that it was so rich and opulent because all of its money and all of its wealth came through the slave trade of Europeans, that they were enslaving from northern Spain and France and the Mediterranean lands, or that they had plundered all their wealth. That was the source of their actual wealth. And just to give you an idea, at the heart, or at the peak of this so-called Golden Age, you have what's called the Martyrs of Cordoba, an interesting episode, where basically all these Christians who had sort of converted to Islam after the conquest of Spain essentially had enough, and they just unburdened their soul publicly and just said, we renounce and denounce Muhammad and we re-embrace Christ, etc., etc. All of them were tortured and killed in the most graphic ways you can imagine. They were skinned alive. The lucky ones were beheaded. Some were crucified. A woman was thrown in boiling oil. Okay, so this is Golden Age Cordoba, the part you never hear about. And, again, to show you what the academics do, whenever this comes up, there's this blame the victim thing that happens. So what happens is most academics say, oh, look at these stupid Christians. They got why would they ruin a good thing and offend the Muslims? Imagine, would they ever say that if it was the opposite? Would they ever say that if Muslims were forced to become Christians and they unburdened themselves and reclaimed Islam? Of course they wouldn't. Another one, I'll give you a perfect example, another historical book that I had to read and review, and it was pretty disgusting, but basically it's called Crusade and Jihad, the 1,000-Year War between something like the global north and the Muslim south, something like that. And the reason I knew about it is my book agent, mentioned it to me because it was coming out a few months before my book, which was titled Sword and Scimitar, 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and the West. So we thought it would be a competitor book. Anyway, I read it, and the book is a tome. It's something like 600 plus pages. And as you can see, it's trying to say it's covering all the centuries, right? 1,000 years war. In that book, the centuries that I described, the most violent ones from the 7th century up until, let's say, the 18th century, right before the colonial era, he gives it 20 pages, okay? This supposedly comprehensive book about Crusade and Jihad. And those 20 pages are the most hygienic pages you'll ever read about how Islam spread all over the place. You won't hear about conquest. You will hear none of what I'm talking about at all, okay? And then the good stuff comes. He finally reaches the point in the colonial era. Now Islam is weak, and now the West has actually entered and dominated Muslim lands and non-Muslim lands in Europe, in Asia and Africa. And now he goes with lurid detail into all many of them are imagined atrocities and horrible things that Europeans did. Okay, so obviously if you don't know better and you read that, and his whole point is to show you that Muslims have grievances and they're not forgetting this and they remember, and et cetera, et cetera. And again, here's a classic, and this was a well-known book and assigned in colleges and universities and so forth. So the end result of all this is what? Obviously mass confusion towards the role of Islam. Most people still, at best, think it's a misunderstood religion. It's the religion of peace, as George Bush told us, of course. That's been hijacked by just a few bad apples. But like I told you, if you think of the worst behavior that you heard of from supposed ISIS, the Islamic State, whether it's the mass beheadings or the carnage that they engage in, the sex slavery, concubinage, selling Yazidi women, et cetera, all of that was on display for 14 centuries nonstop, but on an exponential level. These are the facts, okay? And, all of that has been jettisoned, and the fake history has done its work very well, because now you have Europe, who for centuries, I give you that Theodore Roosevelt quote, existed only because it fought tooth and nail against Islam. And what is it doing now? It's bringing in as many Muslims as it can possibly bring in. If you're not aware, but in a lot of these European nations, especially the Western ones, Sweden especially, the UK, Germany, which have significant Muslim populations, wherever you look, lo and behold, there's violence and criminality, churches are constantly being destroyed, religious statues of Jesus and Mary being beheaded, women being attacked and sexually assaulted, and the grooming that goes on in England. And all of this is, of course, not surprising because the continuity is very evident because it was always there from the start. That's what it was about. So that is the dangers of fake history. And we're living it right now because you don't appreciate what really happened. And I'll leave you the final and very prescient quote by Hilaire Belloc, a European, I think Anglo-French historian, I think a friend or contemporary of Chesterton, who lived between 1870 and 1953. In his book, The Great Heresies, which I think he wrote in 1938. 1938, keep in mind, this is about a century ago, or I mean, almost a century ago. He writes, quote, "Millions of modern people of the white civilization, that is, the civilization of Europe and America, have forgotten all about Islam. They have never come in contact with it. They take for granted that it is decaying, and that anyway it's just a foreign religion which will not concern them. It is, as a fact, the most formidable and persistent enemy which our civilization has had, and may at any moment become as large a menace in the future as it has been in the past. The whole spiritual strength of Islam is still present in the masses of Syria and Anatolia, of the East Asian mountains of Arabia, Egypt, and North Africa. The final fruit of this tenacity, the second period of Islamic power, may be delayed, but I doubt whether it can be permanently postponed." And I think that's where we're at right now.